Hey, guess what? It's my birthday, but October wrap-ups wait for no man or no birthday, but I am gonna wear the birthday headband because I bought it last year and I need to get my money's worth. So let's go ahead without further ado and dive into October reading. But before we dive all the way in, hi, my name is Melody and I talk about books and book adjacent things on this channel. If we have not met yet, I would love for you to want to hang out more. If you feel so inclined, feel free to go ahead and hit the like button and subscribe at your leisure. But jumping back into the books, I first finished Tokyo Uneo Station by Yumiri in Tokyo. Now, I wish I had planned out my reading a little bit more strategically in relation to what I was reading, and we kind of just went where the day took us. And so I didn't think to bring my copy for like great photo ops of this when we went to the actual station for other business, which just kind of proves that I am not a travel vlogger by any means, and I do hope to still have a video kind of talking more in depth about my reading in Japan and the books I picked up in Japan in context of the trip as a whole, but it was very much, or will be very much, framed from a vacation point of view. Just a caveat, which is fine because it was my vacation. And so I read this and I really enjoyed it. It's very short. A lot of the Japanese literature I ended up reading on the trip was very short and concise and succinct, but had big things to say at the same time, even for some of the cozier reads, which we will jump into very shortly since they will fall under my trip. This was a lot more like a social commentary. It had a little bit of a speculative angle in terms of our protagonist, who was or wasn't, but was a ghost, which I feel like the blurb spoils, and I spent a lot of the time trying to figure out when we find out he's a ghost in the narrative. And so it was very interesting being able to contextualize this book against the setting. And I feel like, because I started this before we went to Uneo Station, and I'm sorry for any mispronunciations that will occur during these books, but I feel like after we went, I had a much better visual picture, just because I had any kind of picture for the more obvious observation. So yeah, it's about a kind of ghost that's wandering, but it's also a commentary on social inequity. And yeah, it makes sense that this won some awards because it has a lot to say, and it says it in very concise and pointed language with that kind of flair of something else going on in terms of the speculative. So very much enjoyed this for sure. Next, I read a book because I forgot my e-reader on the train when we were going out to Yokohama, and I just forgot that I would need something to do on the train for that period of time, and one of the books I had just downloaded on my phone was the like novella, short story, somewhere in between there, The Lover by Silvia Moreno-Garcia, and I love Silvia Moreno-Garcia, and it was a great excuse to finally get this read. This is a like Red Riding Hood reimagining, which is fascinating because it has Moreno-Garcia's really telltale, evocative kind of language, that sense of danger, something kind of odd going on, strong female protagonists or flawed or interesting female protagonists. And all of this was happening within the context of a fairy tale that is definitely not my favorite. And so at first I didn't know going in that, or I hadn't remembered that it was a retelling of Red Riding Hood, because it was more kind of a read of circumstance and necessity. And then I was like, oh, I'm really enjoying this when I don't typically enjoy this kind of story family as much as, say, other story families. And I think that it really tapped in to the kind of exploration of Red Riding Hood and what that story represents. And I think it captures that danger and uncertainty of growing up while making Red Riding Hood, or the Red Riding Hood equivalent in this book, a really interesting character, because I don't find her in the original tale all of that interesting, to be completely honest, but I liked this kind of warping of it. Now, there was no like grandmother figure within this. It was a lot more symbolic and a little bit more literal in a lot of ways. And yeah, I really, really enjoyed it. It had like that werewolf kind of angle to it as well. I love any time Silvia Moreno-Garcia does something kind of supernatural, so that was right within my wheelhouse. Really enjoyed this. Next, based on a recommendation from Ashley in a comment on a community post, I read Days at the Morisaki Bookshop by Satoshi Yagasawa, and this is kind of like a cozier, but cozier with a kind of underlying sense of melancholy kind of look at a young woman who is adrift in her life and goes to work at her uncle's bookshop in the bookshop neighborhood of Tokyo. Now, this is another example of, I hadn't started this book yet. I think I started this book like the day after we went to this neighborhood. And so it was nice to have that frame of reference and that context when going into the book, but I also would have loved to kind of see this book and have a concept of the book in context of the neighborhood, especially because we specifically went to this neighborhood for me. Like, I'm not gonna lie, my friend put it on the schedule because of how much I love books, and it is the book neighborhood. And so it has like all of these alleys filled with small bookstores and books on the street, and some of them had signs even to not take pictures or video, which I honored what I saw, and a lot of the stores had signs that they didn't carry English books. And so there was this really robust, and you could like kind of see, we didn't really go into any of them on the inside, but you could feel like that chock full used bookstore, and I think we all kind of know what that feels like. And so there was something kind of otherworldly in a lot of ways to it, and definitely kind of digging into the literary culture as a tourist in Tokyo is something I want to talk about a little bit more in that video. But I really enjoyed having that as a backdrop for this book, and I think it definitely elevated my experience of it, because I could picture, even without having fully gone into one of the stores, when our protagonist talks about sleeping in like a cramped room upstairs, that felt a little bit more visceral to me because of that context. Now, I'm clearly not saying you have to have that context visually and like experience-wise to enjoy the book, but it did elevate it for me, and that's part of the reason I was doing this reading while I was on vacation, and I really enjoyed being able to balance things as well. And I was reading shorter things where I could kind of read before bed. There were 3 of us traveling together, so like in the morning before we all got up and got ready for the day. And so there was the opportunity to kind of sit with some of these books and to knock a bunch out. Also, I started this book in the bathtub of our hotel because there was this beautiful bathtub that I still think about. It was so deep, it was beautiful. I have no pictures of our hotel room, unfortunately. I just didn't think about it because it was like our living space, and then I was like, oh, I wish I had that visual. But the tub was so nice, we were taking turns. We went and we got bath bombs at Lush, and then we were each taking a night, and toward the end, we started to like rotate and sometimes double up on a night and basically just share and enjoy the bathtub. And I started this book in the bathtub, and it was great. It's everything I've ever wanted. Okay, next was the last of the Japanese literature I bought in preparation for the trip that I actually got finished. I started another one that I haven't finished yet, and I have a couple more on my Kobo. If you saw my kind of tentative list in one of my shorts of the things that I was hoping or thinking about buying, I did pare that list down from the like over $100 it was sitting at to around $60. So I bought like these, and then I bought Earthlings, and I bought one more, I can't remember now, but the last book I finished from that grouping was Idle Burning by Rin Usami, which I had been wanting to read prior to this trip, and so it was a great excuse to put that at the top of my TBR, because this is an exploration of idol culture, and it follows the perspective of this young girl who is obsessed with one particular member of a group. I can't remember if it's specifically K-pop or J-pop or what, but to the kind of detriment of everything else in her life, or it's kind of also exploring the alternate possibility that the other parts of her life are so lackluster and she feels no real sense of forward momentum, and she struggles in school or this or that or the other, and so she's channeled all of her energy into this idol. And the book opens with this idol having accosted someone. and the fallout of that and the controversy of that, and just her kind of spiral when she has dedicated so much of herself, like an intense amount, to this one person and that parasocial relationship and that exploration of that parasocial relationship and the loneliness. It was a really great read. I will say I think it tackled or came at it from a slightly different angle than I was anticipating. I don't know what I was anticipating, but I think a lot of these books had a lot more inherent sadness in them than I was expecting. Not that they were like sad, gonna make you cry books, but there was just kind of this undercurrent of sadness, and I don't know how to fully unpack that or explain that in this moment. And again, I was reading a very small sampling, but yeah, that's just something I noticed. Not that it impacted my enjoyment of this by any means, but I think because another book that I read in 2020, one of my favorites of that year, that had a character that was kind of grappling or exploring similar elements, was If I Had Your Face by Frances Cha. Not the same exploration by any means, but there was a character in that that had an obsession. And so I think that had been my prior frame of reference. Additionally, as someone, I haven't read a whole lot of Japanese literature going into this. I've read one Murakami, I have read Convenience Store Woman, which I loved, which is part of the reason I picked up Earthlings, which I haven't read yet. And I actually would love to revisit Convenience Store Woman now that I actually have a much better understanding of convenience store culture, because when I read that in 2019, I had no concept of just how big convenience stores were and what that looks like. And so I definitely think I need to revisit that, in addition to the fact that I enjoyed it so much and it's such a quick and easy read at the end of the day. And so it wouldn't be too burdensome to revisit. And then, even though I did still have Japanese literature, I started reading Strange Weather in Tokyo, but in the middle of that, again, there is this kind of like melancholy inherent in it. Again, not bad, but I was on vacation. And so I started to get a hankering for a romance. And I was like, you know what? You can do what you want. You're on vacation and you have romances you've been meaning to read, including The Marquis Makes His Move by Diana Quincy. Pay no attention to the 1% read. I just accidentally went back to the table of contents. This is the third in the series that includes Her Night with the Duke and The Viscount Made Me Do It, both of which I've read, and is the brother of the female lead in Her Night with the Duke. And so the conceit of this is that our Marquis, Brandon, has been very removed from society because of his parentage, particularly the way his Palestinian mother and her family's background in trade was received or is received by society. And so he is very intent on trying to kind of prove himself to society in a lot of ways. And at the same time, at the start of the book, he has had some land stolen from him due to his neighbor's kind of property lines being drawn into his land on an official map. And instead of like contesting this in the ways that would feel expected, or even like having like an all-out feud with the neighbor on page, he decides the better course of action is to pretend to be a footman in the household of the map maker because he thinks that this man has been bribed by his neighbor, is in his pocket, there's something else going on, and he wants to get to the bottom of it. You know, not your most logical choice, but a choice. And with this, he becomes the footman of the lady of the house, Rose, who he doesn't know, but we do, because we get dual point of view, third person narration, is actually the map maker in the family. She does everything in terms of the maps and the drawing of the maps for her husband, who just kind of handles the commissions and runs the store. And these two, Brandon and Rose, start to become closer to each other, which at first I was not sure how I was going to feel about, because there is a matter of infidelity there in that she is very clearly married, but things become complicated pretty quickly. The husband is not a great guy, which you probably won't be surprised by based on the fact that this is a romance where he is not the romantic lead, and there's really only two ways we can go here. Either he's not a good guy or he dies. Those are the only choices I can think of. If you have other options, please share them. But there is obviously a great lie and secret at the heart of this that I think is grappled with pretty well. Obviously, it's hard because your characters are keeping these really big pieces back. Rose, not as much as Brandon, who is outright lying to her about who he is. And we do get to see his sister a lot in this. We get to see our other couples from the previous books, which is a lot of fun. There's a strong family element there. And I really did like Rose as a protagonist. And we have this kind of tradition with Diana Quincy books of female leads who have a profession or something that they are super passionate about. So if you have not tried Diana Quincy yet, but you love Joanna Shupe, I think that that would be a great place to go for you as a reader. And also, I'm just really, really loving Diana Quincy romance novels. I think I finally discovered her like a year or two ago, and I've really, really enjoyed what I've read so far. And so this I mostly read on the flight back from Tokyo. I wanted so badly to read on the flight to Tokyo, but I hadn't been on an international flight since like the end of high school, let alone an international flight of that magnitude, and I didn't really know what to do with myself. So most of the time I just sat in the dark listening to Noah Kahan's Stick Season Forever album on repeat and disassociating, which I don't know that I recommend, but I don't not recommend it at the same time. And so on my way back, I was much more productive in my reading and knocked out most of this book on the flight back, though I did also spend at least 2 hours sitting in the dark listening to the Noah Kahan album and disassociating, so. And then I returned home to face down my spooky season TBR, which included a book I needed to pick up. One of the first things I did upon returning home was go to the bookstore and pick up my holds and a book that had released that I wanted to read that I didn't get to in October, but it was very important to me that I got my copy of A Sunny Place for Shady People by Mariana Enriquez, because when I tried to pick it up before I went on vacation, they didn't have it in the store yet, and it came in like a day or two before I left, and I had to call them up and ask them if they could hold it longer for me, and they did. And so this is, as you probably know, the most recent short story collection from Mariana Enriquez, following Things We Lost in the Fire and The Dangers of Smoking in Bed, and maybe my favorite title of a short story collection from her yet. And it's interesting because I talked a lot in my Dangers of Smoking in Bed video about how I kind of conceptualized of the first two collections as inverses of each other. And this, I didn't know how to puzzle it into the picture. At the same time, it still does feel like a very cohesive collection, which for me felt like it was focusing on community and loneliness. I did do a brief TikTok review of this that I hope kind of distills some of the kind of overarching themes and thoughts of the book that I may slip in here. But with this release, in checking the copyright page, it does feel like we got the translation pretty speedily in comparison. And so both the Spanish language and English language versions were released in 2024. So these stories really are speaking to the moment that we currently are in. And in a way, in relation to Things We Lost in the Fire and The Dangers of Smoking in Bed, her two previous short story collections that came to us before our share of night last year, at least in English, I consider those collections in my own reading life as kind of inverses of each other in terms of exploring the political is personal and the personal is political. And so I was very interested in how this collection was going to center itself, how it was going to feel in terms of cohesiveness and in relation to my conception of Enriquez's body of work so far. And I was not at all disappointed by the short stories, as I did not anticipate being, and as I always worry just a little bit at the same time that I will be. Additionally, we do have these creepy artworks, kind of scary stories to tell in the dark-esque, bookmarking the collection. Now, when I was looking and kind of peeking through a few reviews, I did see some sentiments kind of expressing that they felt this collection started off slow and picked up at the end. Now, I can kind of understand that sentiment, but I don't necessarily share that sentiment. And I think it comes with some shifts in focus, kind of cohesively, not across the board in either collection. I think of The Dangers of Smoking in Bed as kind of more adolescent or young adulthood in terms of its explorations and the energy behind it. Here, A Sunny Place for Shady People, it feels like a much older collection in terms of the characters, again, not across the board, but also in terms of some of its explorations, particularly around some of the central ideas I found as a reader regarding loneliness and community. And I think that that being a sentiment that is shared across the board or explored in this collection makes a lot of sense in the current moment, post 2020, in how we engage with community, as well, of course, as all of the political and historical context of Argentina that this collection exists within. But one of the stories that stuck with me and was the least kind of overtly horror, which is very much still present in this collection, and that sense of danger, I think, picks up in the more traditional sense at the end, and the stories at the end, which I loved unquestionably. But I think that the disquiet at the beginning is a little bit more subtle, and the horror is still there. We have ghosts evident from the first story, but it's much more a kind of settled disquiet that we kind of have to grapple with within ourselves in some ways, or that horror is a reflection of our own actions, which in a lot of ways is true of horror across the board, but especially within that first story, the context and exploration of community is very apparent. The kind of closest Enriquez equivalent that I can think of off the top of my head would be La Rambla Triste, which we also, I would argue, see kind of echoed in a story at the end. So there is a lot of intertextuality in terms of tone and voice, obviously, but it feels like an Enriquez collection, but it has kind of amped up the stillness in some ways. And Enriquez has always been good at writing stillness, and I think we're seeing that explored in different ways in this collection. That being said, I don't know that I'm smart enough to unpack all of the nuances of the short story collection, but I love the duality that continues to exist in Enriquez's work, where we have this kind of front layer of horror short stories that are enjoyable at that layer and at their face, but when you peel back that face, which I wouldn't put past Mariana Enriquez, there is a lot more complexity and subtlety there to explore as well. So there is a lot of depth. I don't know that I have reached the full depths of this collection yet, but I would highly encourage you to wade into the waters. But in terms of this collection feeling a lot older for me than The Dangers of Smoking in Bed, which again, I'm not speaking in absolutes for either collection, but that one had a lot of stories that for me read as that kind of turbulent adolescent young adulthood energy, and here it felt like some of the stories were grappling with an older energy and this kind of reflectiveness that kind of folds into those ideas of community and loneliness, especially in the first story, My Sad Dead, which follows a woman who is living in a house haunted by her mother, but she can see ghosts in the neighborhood, and she, toward the end of the story, is dealing with a specific ghost of a traumatic event that happened in the community while she was away, and just that being a lasting repercussion of specific events. But there was also a story in here, and I do not remember the name. Was it Metamorphosis, I think? Yeah, it was Metamorphosis. It's just this idea, and maybe it's just because as I get older, I gravitate to things that reflect my personal experience more, and I have not gone through menopause yet, but it's becoming a thing that's coming closer, right? And you realize that you haven't, or I realize that I haven't read a whole lot of narratives that grapple with that change and how big that change is in a woman's life, and coming at it from this kind of horror angle and body horror almost that Enriquez already uses in her work, but this idea of like not recognizing yourself, I think there's something really powerful in that. I don't know if it was the most impactful story of the collection for me personally, but I do think it was really important, and it definitely stuck with me. And it's interesting because I think it kind of falls right in the middle of the collection, and I know that some reviews that I read on Goodreads, so you know, take everything with a grain of salt, take my reviews and thoughts with a grain of salt, talked about how they felt like the collection kind of stalled a little bit, and really picked up momentum at the end. And I do agree that the last stories in this, I think, really were propulsive, absolutely. But I do think that there was a little bit of a stillness in these middle stories that was just as disquieting. So yeah, as usual, this was a hit for me. I think I would need to revisit all of the collections in tandem to kind of see how they flow together, how they're in conversation with each other more directly, and ultimately which one is my favorite. I've only reread Things We Lost in the Fire, and I think I reread that even before Dangers of Smoking in Bed had come out. So I don't know that I have the most immediate responses to all collections to be able to kind of put them together, but I still very much enjoyed this collection, and I did read most of it while standing in line, or a good deal of it, while standing in line waiting for a Sabrina Carpenter cafe pop-up. But you know what? I think she would have approved. Next, I listened to Haunted Ever After by Jen DeLuca, which is the first in her Boneyard Key series. This is the same author who wrote the Renaissance Fair romances, and this takes place in a haunted Florida town where it's kind of cozy. It's like a cozy haunting, but at the same time, there's hauntings. But like our romantic lead, Nick, owns a bakery cafe in town that Cassie, who has moved into the small town haunted house, or most notable haunted house, in that ghosts are very accepted in this community. They have regular ghost tours. All of their tourism really traces back to the fact that this town is haunted, and them kind of grappling with the idea of how you bring in tourist dollars in a small town in Florida in the kind of shadow of things like Disney and like these big attractions. And even Nick has a regular friendly ghost, the old owner of the cafe, who frequently texts him critiques of his changes to the banana bread recipe. And Cassie is having to work out of the cafe because her laptop won't charge at home for some reason, and getting to the bottom of it. And so it is a kind of slower burn while there is still this kind of like ghost mystery lingering in the background, but it's not high stakes until it's high stakes, if that makes sense. I would compare it very specifically to one episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer in terms of like the dynamics of it, but I feel like that may spoil it a little too much. I don't know that it would spoil it, but I'm still going to let you have that experience on your own. But I very much enjoyed listening to it, and it grappled with a protagonist who has moved to a new town and is feeling very adrift in her life. Nick is feeling adrift in his life in many ways as well, and kind of reflecting the ideas of these hauntings and having to move forward in some way. So ultimately, it was cute. It was a fun time. I don't know that it was revolutionary for me. I don't know if I liked it more than the Renaissance Festival romances I've read so far. I really liked Well Met, but it's definitely a great addition to her body of work. Okay, next I read An Academy for Liars by Alexis Henderson, which I'm not gonna dive too much into because I do plan to do a feature Friday for this one. But I love an Alexis Henderson, as you may well know. I've talked about The Year of the Witching and House of Hunger, both in dedicated videos on this channel as well. So she's given us witches and cults. She's given us vampire adjacent social commentary. And here we have dark academia. And it is really fun. It's dark, it's delicious. It has that twisted, complicated female protagonist that's coming into her own power. And you can see here, it is a little chunkier than House of Hunger for sure, and I think even Year of the Witching. And so we're playing with pacing here, and it's a much more internal book in a lot of ways. So there's a lot to think about here, and I have had to kind of sit with it. I moved very slow through this book, and I think it's because I wanted to savor it and really enjoy it, and because it did kind of have like that fall tone. It was paced very well in terms of a lot of things happening. We'll talk about all of that more in depth, but I think that it still managed to let you sink into it in a lot of ways. And I anticipate a decent amount of the Feature Friday on this being an exploration of the intricacies of an Academy for Liars versus an Academy of Liars, because I keep kind of changing it in my mind, but it's very specific wording. It's for a reason. We'll talk about all of it, but I very much enjoyed it. It's a great addition to Henderson's canon. I'm very excited to see what she continues to give us. My only critique would be, because this is kind of like a matte black jacket, and so I had to take it off because I was getting it dirty, but then the inside is white. And this is a signed copy that I wanted to keep as neat as possible because the bookstore mailed it so nicely. I didn't want to mess it up. But yeah, so we'll talk about the moth too. There's so much to talk about. Maybe I'm finally finding the words to talk about it. But Lennon and Dante, the main characters of this, are dark and interesting. And I love that she does that thing that she does in House of Hunger, where you can't fully trust the characters, and so you're not really sure. There's a lot of complexity there, a lot of depth. I really enjoyed it. Speaking of dark academia, I have not read ML Rio's If We Were Villains, but I did listen to Graveyard Shift this month as part of my Halloween TBR, and it was fun. It's a novella that follows a bunch of different people that work the kind of like night shift or are up at night for whatever reason, that congregate in this church yard, mostly for smoke breaks for a lot of them, but it's like the night reporter from campus and a bartender and a driver and just a bunch of disparate people kind of coming together, and they're kind of clashing personalities in the midst of that. And one night when they kind of are gathering in this place, they discover an empty grave, or a newly dug grave, not an empty grave, a newly dug grave. It's a very different dynamic. And so it's the kind of spiraling and unraveling of that mystery over the course of the night. I like what it did with point of view here, because we did jump to all of the characters over the course of the evening as they kind of added different perspectives to the overall story and just kind of how it hopped. So it felt very much like an episode of supernatural television that I would have watched as a teenager, and how all of those storylines kind of wove together. I think it was successful at what it did. It was tight. It told a full story. I would have loved to see more from it, I think, because there was a lot of potential, but at the same time, I respect that it kept it to the bare bones for what it wanted to do. And I can't fault that. I think that there was an opportunity for more depth in terms of like the thematics of it, but I also think that there is a lot of room for debate of the thematics of it as it exists. So I realized I skipped a book. I read 13 books and DNF'd 2 this month. Now, granted, there was a couple novellas and like a short story, or like 3 like short story novella adjacent things, and the books I read at the beginning of the month were pretty short. So that's neither here nor there, but that is what I read. So I also read Magnate by Joanna Shupe, which is a historical romance in Kindle Unlimited, but it is one of Joanna Shupe's Gilded Age romances. It's part of, or the first in her Knickerbocker Club trilogy series. I think it is the only one in Kindle Unlimited, but while I am in Kindle Unlimited, I figured I might as well go through all of her stuff that I haven't read that is available. And so this is following Emmett, who has built an empire, as he is approached by Lizzie, who is the younger sister of the owner of a railroad empire, who has some suspicions that maybe their finances aren't great based on some of the moves her brother is making. And her brother is like the main caretaker of her. But she knows how to work the stock market. She isn't allowed to work the stock market, though. She has these dreams, and so she goes to Emmett because she thinks that he is a friend of her brother. He is a business associate of her brother that has a very tenuous relationship with him, but she doesn't know that, and so she trusts him. And basically they make this wager that if she can get a certain return on a specific amount of money within a certain amount of time, he will fund this business for her. Now, this obviously puts them in closer proximity, and certain temptations come into play. And when those temptations are acted upon, there may be consequences in the way of marriage of circumstance. And so yeah, there's a lot of tension here, particularly between Emmett and Lizzie. And it's interesting because this has a lot of Shupe's hallmarks, particularly in relation to Lizzie and her having an occupation of sorts that's outside of the bounds of what society expects of her as an upper class lady. But at the same time, there's pieces of this that read a little differently. It's not necessarily like an earlier Shupe, because this is 2016. So maybe, I feel like maybe I came into Shupe right around this time or right after this time, so maybe it is like that earlier iteration. But also Emmett reads much more as like, if you like billionaire romance, like contemporary billionaire romance, I think this is the historical equivalent of that. And some of those tensions and the way those dynamics kind of come across are more in line with that in a lot of ways. And there is that kind of business sabotage angle that is in the background, and the tensions between Emmett and Lizzie's brother and all of that are going on that come into play. And I need to finish the series, but I don't think the others are on KU, so we will see how that goes. And then going back, I read a library copy on my Kobo of 50 Beasts to Break Your Heart by Jenna Rose Nethercott. Now, I actually started this the beginning of the year, January, February, whenever it came out. I had a library copy, a physical library copy, and I got stuck in one of the stories. It was the story about the War of Fog. I don't remember the exact story name, but I needed to go back, and so I started from there. Now, I loved the first story of this collection. It almost felt kind of like Welcome to Night Vale-esque, and there was that sense throughout. It wasn't the same kind of humor by any means, but there was this kind of dark comedy in some of the stories, even if it was just kind of like circumstantial, or just like it being odd enough that there is that bit of humor that is in relation to that oddity. But I love the odd, I love the supernatural and the slightly dangerous that were lurking here, and I think that the tone of it was like whimsical, but like a darker whimsical, in the vein, I guess, of even just fairy tales, which makes sense because she has a fairy tale-esque book sitting in my unread pile above my head every video, which I am much more interested in expediting now. Like, I've been meaning to read it for years, clearly, but I really, really liked the tone of these stories. Like, sure, there were a couple that I got a little tired of, or that I got stuck in, like that one, but overall I really, really loved this collection. I did get nervous when I got to the eponymous story, or the titular story, that we were going to go through 50 Beasts, especially because I was reading that part very late at night, but we didn't go through the full 50, and the framing device of that was really interesting. And part of the reason I didn't want to go through that many beasts was we were introducing all of these new kind of whimsical, monstrous creatures, and there were drawings, and it was really interesting and whimsical in a lot of ways, but there wasn't at first anything to connect me to those creatures. I was just reading a bestiary, going back to that whole argument of what the proper pronunciation of that is, which is interesting. Like, the idea and the thought exercise of creating all of these creatures from whole cloth is an interesting one, but then it does something really interesting with that as a framing device, and there's like a story within the story there of the people compiling this list of monsters, or this book of monsters, and just what that is. So it was very clever and interesting, but you had to go through those to get to that story, and the pacing of it, I was a little nervous about at first, but it really managed it well. It didn't go on too long, which I thought was nice. And actually, I think these are the perfect kind of fall winter short stories, in the way that they are kind of odd and fairy tale-esque, but there's just something that feels like the winter in them for me. I mean, I would read them anytime, but I definitely think that if this sounds good to you, now would be a great time to dive into them. And then I read What the Dead Know by Nghi on Kindle Unlimited, which is a short story that's an Amazon exclusive. Not my favorite for it to be exclusive, but I love Nghi's writing, and this was about a couple of traveling spiritualists who get into a scrape at this like country school, and it has those like Hallmark, slightly odd kind of worlds. Like, the way these two characters are introduced is so active. They're like thrown off a train, and we get from the very beginning that they're con artists of a sort in the age of spiritualism, but then we enter this world more, again, within 30 pages, and realize that there is a matter of oddness and supernatural to this world, that ghosts aren't so far off the path for this world. And so the way that that opens up is just so beautiful and interesting. It's one of the things that I loved most in the work from Vogue that I've read. The writing is so lyrical. So much happens within the course of the story. The pacing of it is just so good. It moves so well, and it's so evocative in its language and the pictures it paints and how it explores character. And so I was just like, yes, this, again, also going back to the Jenna Rose Nethercott, but this in particular, like, it's just a really solid example of short story writing, and especially genre short story writing, and just how skilled it is. Now, unfortunately, this was so refreshing to me at this point. One, because I'm always excited about Vo's work, do not get me wrong, but in trying to kind of explore Kindle Unlimited a little bit more, I did try out a couple of books that would fit within the kind of paranormal romance realm for the season, and I had to DNF both of them pretty early on in the book, and I do not want these to stand in comparison to the Vo. Like, I'm not saying that, but at the same time, I have to be honest with you, and these books were not good. The writing was not good. It was very thin. It was very like, this happened, let's talk about them. And I don't want to just sit here and like bash a book necessarily, but as much as I really dive into the intricacies and love talking about books, and we're going to have a book at the end of today that there's going to be more to dive into and like what I thought was successful and not. Here, I do not think that the writing was successful at all. So Ghost Walk by Cassandra Gannon, I was really excited about this book because it had the possibility of being like an adult Meg Cabot mediator kind of mixed with Karen Marie Moning's Highlander series, in that it is following an investigator who had something happen on a case, and she's been kind of like, her life has been kind of thrown into an upset, and then she ends up meeting a ghost of a colonial or like a American Revolution era pirate. How would I not love that? It's essentially time travel, ghosts. It sounded right up my alley. The writing was so bad, and the characterization was so bad. And at one point, like, she has a boyfriend, and there's a whole scene with him that reads like the really over the top, over dramatized part of a fan fiction. And again, I'm not using fan fiction as a derogatory here, but there is a certain level of like thing you take for granted in a fan fiction. Like, I like the kind of campy moments in fan fiction where you have this character who has almost become its own thing within fandom, or certain aspects or circles of fandom, or certain fan fiction genres within that fandom, and that character becomes a little bit more of a caricature and a little bit more oversized and a little bit more like mustache twirly villain without anything there. But at the same time, with fan fiction, you have all of this understanding of the characters that come into play before you sit down with the book, or the fan fiction, I should say. Here, we have very thin characters, and we do not know them, and the writing is very blunt, and especially with time travel, because I love time travel, and I recognize, well, one, again, especially with romance, and I know we've talked about this before, you're always writing for the time that you are currently in, but I like the kind of clash and conflict of different mores in different eras, and I feel like that's harder right now. I'm actually reading The Ministry of Time, and I'm going to be very excited to report back on that, and for us to dive and talk about that more, because I think it's grappling with some of that in a much more active way. I was willing to have some suspension of disbelief in this, but I just couldn't. And I understand a character that comes from like this old era that may have different expectations of how men and women behave, but there were a lot of like these misogynistic overtones that I anticipate later in the book would have gotten challenged and kind of confronted, but the writing was so bad and there was so little nuance to it that I didn't trust it to successfully have a reversal there, nor did I think it was interesting enough or well developed enough to have enough suspension of disbelief for me to enjoy dynamics there as they were presented. It was just info dumpy. I didn't enjoy it. I DNF'd it at 16%. I was bummed. Then I tried another book that I'd seen in at least a few TikToks, which is neither here nor there, and I think I saw them because the aesthetics of this book were perfect. It was Spookly Yours by Jennifer Chitman. Cute cover, fall vibes. It was about a young witch and a demon cat, like a familiar situation when really he's a demon. And I was like, I've read, I think, is it Sarah Hawley that has some books kind of in that vein of the rom-com genre that I've really enjoyed of what I've read. I actually think I've only read one. I need to read the other two, but I enjoyed that one. So I was like, oh yeah, this sounds right up my alley. The formatting of the book is actually really cute. There's like little pumpkins and things in like the breaks. But then I read the text and it was not well written. There was a lot of repetition of thoughts and ideas even within the first few lines. And it was also like just throwing things about fall at the reader, like romanticization of like things that people love about fall, to kind of just play on that like whimsy of people loving fall without actually establishing place or character. It was just like, these are all things we love about fall. And I will admit being kind of disappointed about how many highlights I saw in those passages, because there was nothing I love a romanticization and a presentation of something in some like purpley, flowery language that makes you feel cozy and wrapped up in that thing you love. But this was just like blunt language used to play on the emotion of the reader, but the language was too blunt to play on the emotion of the readers. I don't know how to fully explain this, except there is an illustration of it even within the beginning of the book. So our protagonist is getting a new cat because her previous cat had passed, but her previous cat's name was Binks. And I know, benefit of the doubt here, that was just meant to be like a cute reference to kind of be like, oh yeah, just like if you know kind of thing. But because of the way everything else was written, it was just like one more thing where it was taking the reader's like already existing assumptions and knowledge and things people love about fall and like playing on that emotion without building anything specific in this world for this world. And I didn't like that. I will say I did like that it had dual point of view. I did like that, but I just couldn't. And again, I'm not trying to just sit here and bash things, but I don't DNF that often, or I haven't historically DNF'd that often. So 2 books in 1 month, I was a little bummed about. Now, kind of in tandem with that idea though, in relation to the last book I read this month, which is another book that we will talk about more in depth in a Feature Friday, because while I don't know that it was ultimately successful for me, I think there's a lot to talk about with it, especially in terms of form, and it had something it was attempting, and that is Creation Lake by Rachel Kushner. And you're like, Melody, that was longlisted for a Booker. Of course it was attempting something. Like, yes. I don't know that I found it successful, and I read a lot of this in some reading sprints I did because I needed to prioritize this as it was due back at the library, and I put a lot of other holiday like spooky reading on hold to prioritize this, partially because I was so intrigued. It was about a spy infiltrating a cult commune kind of thing, and that is exactly up my alley. But the way into it was a little odd for me. It's very philosophical and the action is very pared back in a way that it feels like the author falsely believes that action would make the book less literary. And I understand moving slower, but I think there was more potential there. I will say, I think the star of the show is the point of view, and I think the star of the show is meant to be the point of view, because we are in the first person point of view of this private sector spy who is very cocky and very ultimately flawed, but she thinks she is the smartest person in the room. And so to be seen through the eyes of someone who kind of holds everyone around them in much lower esteem is interesting, while her worldview and thoughts are being kind of warped and shifted by the emails that she has hacked into of one of the commune's mentors, who was not as active as I thought he was going to be within the narrative itself based on the blurb. It reminded me somewhat of the philosophical ponderings in Beautiful World, Where Are You? But those made sense within the course of the narrative for me. Here, it felt like it was a kind of break in the momentum of the narrative, and it took us a while to get into the action of things. And I understand the kind of blending of them. And again, we will dive into all this more in depth in a Feature Friday, I think. But I don't know why we spent so many kind of breakaways talking about Neanderthals. In some ways, the concept of this reminded me a little bit of Birnam Wood in terms of that exploration of communes and the analysis of class and like what kind of people are involved in these counter movements, what the weaknesses of these counter movements are, what there's a lot to be said there, right? Absolutely. But I don't know that we got to spend enough time in that environment to fully explore that. But again, the real star of the show in this book was the point of view. And while it was kind of slow, and toward the end I was getting frustrated, so it felt like a little bit more of a slog to get through, at the beginning it was very fast. It's a very fast read. It's not like too dense in its narration by any means. You just get to a certain point, or at least I got to a certain point, and I'm like, what's happening? Why are we here? Why do I care? I think is the main kind of crux of it. And again, even with a flawed protagonist, you can still have reasons to care or be interested in what that protagonist is going to do. But it wasn't necessarily a narrative that kept me at arm's length in terms of like that mental fuzz I talk about sometimes, but I had trouble kind of conceiving of what was happening, even as the conceit of it was incredibly active. So I don't know. We'll circle back to that and talk about that more in depth. But if you have thoughts about any of these books that I read or DNF'd this month, I would love to hear yours. As always, I am very grateful that you are interested in what I have to say about books. So thank you for hanging out and being interested. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good. And yeah.